In this video, I'm going to show you two things that you can do with your lead wrist that are going to give you way more power and way more accuracy. And who doesn't want those in their golf swing? The first one is going to really surprise many of you. We're going to be using the hack motion coming through my phone. You can see the device on my hand here to really kind of take a bit of a deep dive as to what is actually happening with that wrist. And there's going to be some information here which can really help you with your golf game. Let's start with wrist set. We all need wrist set. This is where a lot of our power comes from. So if I took a setup, made kind of half a backswing and kind of held it here, took my tray hand off, I think we'd all agree that's a pretty good wrist set. My lead arm is kind of level with the ground, club shaft is give or take vertical, so that gives me around about 90 degrees through my lead forearm and cob. This is what we class as kind of wrist set. This would be an unset wrist, this would be a set wrist. So when I'm in this position, how much movement have I actually got in my wrist? Well, have a look at the hack motion. It's showing that I've got +6, +7, +8 of what we call radial deviation. That's not a big number. So watch what happens when I take the club away and open up the fingers on my lead hand. Well, look at where my fingers are relative to my forearm. They're pretty much in a line. So that gives me, you can see there, -1. So this wrist, if I was to let it fall by my side, is in an extremely natural position. If I just stood to you chatting, you know, look at those numbers there. You can see they're very, very close to 0. So how have I got my wrist in a very natural position where it's not really done anything, yet we're classing that as wrist set? Because my wrist there isn't really doing anything. This is where the secret lies. Your wrist set happens at setup. Let me explain what I mean. If you come around from down the line, let me show you a really exaggerated version of how I would put my lead hand on the golf club. Look at this, fingers fall in line with my forearm. That's my wrist in its natural position. You can see there, -7, pretty close to 0. But how do I place my hand on the golf club? What do? I do this. I point my fingers way back towards my legs. Now look at that number, -48. I've basically bent my wrist by 50 degrees. So what do I do in the golf swing? Well, I actually take it from this kind of bent position, we call that ulnar deviation, and actually in the takeaway, all I do is I move it back to normal. So let me show you what that would look like. There's my wrist set up to nearly 50 degrees. That allows me to put it right in my fingers, hold it in my fingers and close the hand around it. So when I'm set up, if I now do a half a backswing, get myself set up here, at setup, I've got my wrist in this down cocked position, -42, -43. So what am I doing in my backswing? I'm simply taking it from that sort of cocked position back to neutral. You can see there, +4. It's in a very, very neutral position now, but that's what we do. So the wrist set and whether you're able to set your wrists is dictated by how you place your hands on the golf club. Now, so many of you who are struggling with wrist set, who are struggling with power, who see your lead arm bend, it's because you're not setting the golf club correctly at address. What I see all too often is golfers placing the golf club in the hand like this, where they haven't created the right kind of sort of ulnar deviation. So if I place the golf club like this, very much through the palm, and grip it, look what that number is. -9, -10. I haven't set my wrist at setup, so I've got nowhere to go. I can go back to neutral, but that's only 10 degrees. So what happens when I have this palmy grip? Guess what? I can't set my wrist because I've got nowhere to go. So what happens is we start to either flex that lead wrist to get some sort of power, or we start to twist the golf club open to get ourselves a little bit more leverage. You can see now we've got that number up to sort of 17, 18, but I had to open the face. So positioning the golf club poorly in your lead hand at setup robs you of the correct wrist set, robs you of power, and then forces you to make the wrong movements to make up for that. Flexing of the arm, twisting the wrist open like this. Those movements, if you've got them in your golf swing, it's often because you can't do the right thing for your wrist. So here's what you're going to do. You're going to very simply learn this. Take your trail hand, get rid of that. We're not talking about that one at the moment. Imagine you've got a golf club, okay? Here's what you're going to do. You're going to take your fingers, point them right between your heels. That gives me -43. That's my setup. I would grip the club from there. And then you take those fingers, turn and point them away from you, back towards that camera, -8. So I go from in between my heels to pointing away from me. In between my heels, pointing away from me. That's wrist set. It's actually creating it at the setup and taking it out through the golf swing. We're removing movements in the wrist as opposed to adding it in. And that's the big difference. We think of wrist set as something we add in. It's actually something that you take out. So what you're then going to do, grab yourself a short iron. I've got myself 8. What's my wrist there? You can see 41, -41, which is perfect. And I'm simply going to rehearse, take it out, take it out, and I can go ahead and hit some little shots doing that. And even though that was a really short swing, I generated the power. That's the key part. So this first part is all about generating the right power and actually making sure we don't make those big mistakes, bending of the arm, twisting of the wrist, and make up for a poor grip and a poor setup. Next, I want to talk to you about accuracy. I've got you more power. We need to direct that in the right place so you can hit straight shots. This comes down to this movement in your lead wrist. Now, we call this extension or cup, and then flexion or arching. What we do with this wrist through the golf swing directly influences the club face. Let me show you what I mean by that. If I take my lead hand grip, place the club into this position, you can see those grooves are vertical. If I extend my wrist, the club face opens. If I flex my wrist, the club face closes. So as we change the angle in the wrist, and you can see those numbers changing from -40 to, give or take, +40, we change where the club face points. So this movement directly relates to your club face. Really simply, if you can't control your club face, you can't control the golf ball. I'm going to show you how to control it. So one of the biggest faults that I see is that at the top of the golf swing, the golfer would have too much what we call extension of the wrist. You can see that's +36. Now what we said a moment ago is that as we extend the wrist, we open the face. So if your wrist is cupped or extended at the top, your club face is open. What do you do from there? Well, you spend most of your time looking out on the right for your golf balls, or you start to swing over the top to fix it, or you start to early release to fix it, you start backing up. All of those things that you might have seen in your golf swing are there to actually help you overcome the fact that you've got this kind of cupped wrist. Now, many of you might be watching this thinking, yeah, I know that, Chris. I know my wrist gets cupped. I know it needs to be a little bit flatter. I'm trying to work on it. Well, I'm here to tell you that actually thinking about this lead wrist might not be the way to fix it. There's often reasons why it gets cupped. Let me explain what I mean. So let's go to the top, and you can see my wrist at setup +45, and you can see that visibly there's some sort of cupping in that wrist. So what about if I get to the top and flatten it out? You can see now that it's +6, +5. So it's pretty flat. That's kind of where I want it. But watch what happens if I do nothing with my lead wrist or nothing intentionally, but take my right arm, my trail arm, and move into a less than ideal position. So I'm going to take my elbow, I'm going to move it out behind me, I'm going to raise it, and I'm going to kind of push it up and more behind me. Well, look what my wrist has done now, +41. Back to a really, really cupped wrist and a really open face. So basically, if I put my club back there, because my right arm moved and did something different, it forced the wrist into this cup position. So if your right arm isn't doing the right thing, it's almost impossible for you to get this wrist flat. And you might have done that. You might have stood there and thought to yourself, I've got to get this wrist flat, and found it almost impossible because of what your right arm is doing. So we've got to get your right arm working better. That's how we get this lead wrist working better. Now, why does the right arm not do the right thing? Body. What we're doing here is we're going back through the chain. We're saying lead wrist, we can see that, but what's causing it? Right arm. What's causing that? Body. So what I see really quite commonly from the golfers that I coach is a lack of turn early. So they don't use their body well enough. And because they're not using their body well enough, what do they do with their hands and arms? Well, they use their right arm to sort of drag the club back and around. And then we get this position we've just spoken about. What the great players do is they use their body earlier. they use a lot more body rotation, which allows them to keep the arms more in front of them and allows them to set that trail arm much, much better. I call this the kind of frozen shoulder, where this shoulder doesn't move enough. And when that shoulder doesn't move enough, you're forced to use more hands and more arms. Right arm gets out of position, left wrist gets really, really cupped, 48, 49, and then from there, you're in a whole world of trouble. Now we see that as the left wrist being cupped, but we've got to work on it through the body. Now I've got this little ball here. This is going to go between my forearms. You can, I'm sure, find something at home or grab something. There are even training aids out there that work between your elbows. As long as it goes either between your forearms or your elbows, it's going to work. Now I'm going to put that between my forearms. I'm going to take my setup. It's obviously not that easy to get this sorted, but if I keep my trail shoulder in its position, that kind of frozen shoulder, and my arms are forced to do most of the work, then even at halfway back, that ball is going to fall out. My wrist there is plus 40, it's extended, okay? Think of it as the sequence of events. This didn't move. It forced this to overcompensate, and that forced this to cup. It's a sequence of events, and we have to get to the root cause if we really want to try and fix that issue. So here's what I'd love you to do. Place this ball that you've found in your house between your forearms. Just going to get it in position there. Take a setup. Okay, I've got my ulnar deviation, you can see minus 40, I've got my wrist extended, and I'm going to simply move my body and go halfway back and stop. Now look at those numbers. I've taken my wrist set out that I had at the start. It's now back to minus 8, and my wrist is pretty flat. But it was all to do with, if that ball stays in place, what I did with my body. For me to do that, I was really focusing on a really good body pivot. Now that's going to be difficult for many of you. You're going to find that quite a challenge. That's okay. It's not meant to be easy. There's a reason why good golf is difficult, but it's understanding the kind of things beneath what you see. So the two things I'd love you to work on in your golf swing. Number one, making sure that you get your wrist set correctly at address. So important. And then number two, making sure that you can get from your setup halfway back here with your wrist pretty flat and your right arm in a good position. How do you get your right arm in the right position? You keep something between your forearms. You keep something between your elbows. I'm sure you've seen those training aids that you can put between your elbows. That is absolutely golden for this great little exercise, okay? And then what we're gonna do is just get you to hit some shots. And that was obviously nowhere near full speed, partly because there's a greenkeeper on the green, but we don't need to go at full speed. All we need to do really is mimic the right movement at slow speed, and we're going to start to see the right kind of numbers. So if we look at where my wrist was, you can see at address it was plus 40. At the top, which is basically the end of my backswing, it was plus 14. Now that doesn't need to be 0, it just needs to be less than it was at setup. So I went from plus 40, I took it out, which is exactly what I need to do. The only way I can do that is by getting my right arm to work well, and the only way I can get my right arm to work well is if my body moves well.